coming in. All right, everyone. Welcome to Book Chat 2A, dealing with mapping and the Middle East. We have two really interesting books. I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of our authors and let them kind of describe and talk a little bit about their books, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. I think we're going to start with Yossef. You guys decided that his book, whoops. Maybe we're sharing a screen. That his book chronologically would be a good one to start with. So Yossef is a professor in Islamic history at Queen Mary University in London. And his research focuses on the social, cultural, and legal history of the Middle East, which is 1100 to 1500. His publications include The Lost Maps of the Caliphs, Drawing the World in 11th Century Cairo, which is co-authored with Emily Savage Smith, which is published with the University of Chicago Press in 2018, and Islamic Maps, the text he will be speaking about today, published with Bodleian Library in 2019. His UK Arts and Humanities Research Council research on a unique tax survey from the 13th century Fayum resulted in an annotated edition and translation of the tax survey published as The Villages of Fayum, a 13th century register of rural Islamic Egypt by Brepols in 2018, and as a monograph, Rural Economy and the Tribal Society in Islamic Egypt, also published by Brepols in 2018. Our second author is Zayde Antrim. She is professor of history and international studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. She received her BA in history from the University of Virginia and her master's of philosophy in modern Middle Eastern studies from Oxford in 1997 and a PhD from Harvard in history. She is the author of Roots and Realms, The Power of Place in the Early Islamic World, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2012, and Mapping the Middle East, the text she's going to speak about today, published by Reaktion Books in 2018, and she's recipient of a fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So Yossef will go ahead and start, and if anyone has questions, please feel free to send them privately in the chat, and we can have all those at the end.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen and hello.
There we go. Perfect.
Thank you very much, all. Thank you, Kory, and thank you for all tuning in. I recognize a few names and faces. Over the past decade, pre-modern Islamic maps have come to attract much more attention than ever before, I think. Partly this is a consequence of the greater visibility, accessibility through the internet. But this is also because notions of Islamic identities are being contested, set against a one-dimensional view of Islam that is solely derived from legal text. The study of material objects in general brings to the fore a more complex and pluralistic image of Islamic societies. And in this struggle over the future direction of Islam, maps, I believe, have a major role to play. I wrote this book, Islamic Maps, because I felt there was a need for an accessible introduction that would place pre-modern Islamic maps within the social and political context in which they were produced. Islamic maps shouldn't be only a decoration added or adorning general surveys of Islamic history. Instead, there has been an outpour of new research, actually 5 monographs, I think, in the last decade, and even new discoveries. And I wanted to bring together this new knowledge so as to allow scholars of Islamic history and of cartography in other eras and cultures to be able to read these maps in a meaningful way. Of course, in the more general field of history of cartography, the vast majority of output is about European maps. And I think Islamic maps are often relegated to the margins. And again, paralleling common views of Islamic civilization, Islamic maps often make their appearance only as a prelude to what is seen as the more successful, more precise, early modern mapping, European mapping. I wanted to engage with these maps on their own terms, for their own sake. In order to achieve this, I decided to focus the book on map makers, on the map makers themselves. What was the purpose of their maps? What choices did they make? And what was the argument they were trying to convey? I chose 5 map makers that I think reflect the diversity of the Islamic world. They are Sunni and Shia, Arabic-speaking Persian and Turkish. They hail from Isfahan in the east to Palermo in the west, from Istanbul to Cairo and Aden. The first is the 9th century mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, best known as the founder of the science of algebra. His map of the Nile is the earliest extant map made in the Muslim world. It is a testimony to the early achievements of mathematical cartography and also the challenges it has faced. The second chapter deals with the most popular Muslim map maker of all time, the 10th century geographer Al-Istakhri, who avoided mathematical cartography in favor of abstract diagrams. These abstract diagrams, as I learned actually from the research by Zayde, who will join me in this panel, helped foster cultural unity in a world of Islam that was politically fragmented. The third chapter examines the author of a recently discovered 11th century Egyptian cosmography. I myself have spent nearly 2 decades studying these treatises. And here in this chapter, in this book, I highlight the author's representation of urban spaces, of cities and of port cities in particular. The following chapter, I try to cast a fresh look on the most famous map maker of the Middle Ages in general, Al-Idrisi. He worked in Northern Sicily, and I think Al-Idrisi is well known, but some of his maps, like this one, is not so well understood, and his work in general is not really well conceived. It is more seen is characterized in all sorts of ways. So I try to make a better understanding of Al-Idrisi. My 5th and final map maker, which is, I think, an obvious choice, is the Ottoman pirate Admiral Piri Rais and his early 16th century maps of the Americas and of the Mediterranean. This is Malta. I then close with a chapter on diagrams and instruments for finding the direction of Mecca, focusing on the popularization of geographical gadgets in the early modern Safavid Empire in Iran. Even in this final chapter, I emphasize that Islamic maps were not, generally speaking, religious artifacts. The maps and the gadgets were guides to this world, but not to salvation. Even maps showing the direction of prayer towards Mecca do not generally carry theological statements. The southern orientation of many Islamic maps has probably nothing to do with the sanctity of Mecca. South is at the top, but this is most probably a convention. It is neither necessary nor desirable to reduce Islamic maps to the religious beliefs of their makers. They are much more complex, much more interesting than that. And also, some of them, I hope to show, are simply very beautiful. There are over 60 map images in this book. And as the production by the Bodleian publishing house has been so exquisite, I think it's just a feast to the eyes. And I hope that many will read this book, but I hope that even many more will enjoy it. And I want to finish this short presentation, but just saying that I truly believe that no other type of artifact captures so many dimensions of Islamic civilizations. I really think that maps are the best way to understand the medieval Islamic worldview. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Yossef. It looks like a great text, and I definitely believe it is a feast for the eyes. And now we'll move on to Zayde, and she'll talk about her text, Mapping the Middle East.
Okay, great.
And you might have to
Yeah, I
unshare
stopped
your-
sharing.
Yeah.
Stop sharing.
All right, now let me get my share ready. Can everyone see that?
Yep, I can.
Is that working? Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is actually just show a slideshow of the approximately 70 maps that are reproduced in this book while I talk, but I'm not actually gonna talk about each one individually. I also wanted to say that full citation and description information for each of them is in the book itself, but if you wanted to email me, I would be more than happy to give information about any particular map you see while I'm talking. Mapping the Middle East is a book that covers 1,000 years of mapping from the 11th to the 21st centuries. Now, my previous work is on ideas of place in the medieval Islamic world, but I do have some training in the modern period, and as a faculty member at a small liberal arts college in the United States, and the only Middle Easternist in the history department, I end up teaching, well, I teach all sorts of things, but I teach a lot about the modern Middle East. So I thought that I was well positioned to take on a project like this. Moreover, I felt that it was really important to bridge the so-called modern, pre-modern divide, especially from the point of view of a pre-modernist myself, because I sometimes am concerned with the way work on the modern period gestures to the pre-modern as a kind of foil, and something that stresses the absence of certain ideas and practices. Nonetheless, covering 1,000 years was a daunting prospect. So I considered doing what Jordana Dim and Carl Offen did in their wonderful edited volume, Mapping Latin America, in which a group of scholars with expertise in different periods and places each present a single map and then produce an essay contextualizing it. This would have highlighted the many people whose specialized work I build on in this book and contributed, as Dim and Offen put it in their title, a kind of cartographic reader for teaching that could be used for teaching or other purposes. And by the way, if you don't know this book, you should check it out. It's wonderful. But I decided not to do that, mostly because I really wanted to make my own intervention by constructing an overarching argument based on a longue durée diachronic analysis. And in order to do this, I of course had to be pretty selective to produce, in the generous words of one of my reviewers, a small scale map as opposed to a large scale map. So this involved a lot of choices. As we know, small scale maps are used for different things than large scale maps. And I hoped that what the book lacked in detail and coverage, I could make up for in the power and clarity of my argument. So let me just lay out my argument for you. It's in two parts. First and foremost, I argue that people in the region have been making maps of their own worlds for centuries. And I don't think this goes without saying, as Yossi said in his presentation, most histories of cartography are still strikingly Eurocentric. And those that do deal with other parts of the world tend to emphasize their encounters with Europe and European maps from the 15th and 16th centuries on. Nonetheless, my second argument in the book is that those very encounters and the subsequent rise of the nation state have severely constrained spatial thinking, making it difficult to visualize other possibilities. In this light, engagement with the pre-colonial, pre-national period is intended not only as an assertion of the chronological depth of indigenous mapping traditions, but also as nourishment for our geographical imaginations. As I put it in the conclusion to the book, this is not to say that old maps are necessarily better maps, but they are different, sometimes radically different, and thus may suggest possibilities that have been foreclosed in more recent thought. Briefly, the book is organized in 5 chapters, each around a set of maps that I believe are representative or compelling examples of regional or super-regional thought in the period. So chapter 1, Mapping the Realm of Islam, explores the way in which a super-region known as the Realm of Islam, or the Mamlakat al-Islam in Arabic, was mapped between the 11th and the 15th centuries. Its subdivisions were envisioned as distinctive but porous units connected to each other and the lands beyond by an emphasis on proximity and collective ritual practice. Chapter 2 argues that mapping traditions in the Ottoman Empire, emerging in the 16th century, were expressions of belonging in meaningful regions rather than claims to territory or sovereignty. They tend to be series of large-scale maps that stressed mobility and blurred what might be thought of as political or cultural borders. Chapter 3, European colonial mapping in the long 19th century, investigates traditions of European colonial mapping in Egypt, Algeria, and Palestine, up to the well-known maps that I think you're seeing on your screen right now, produced during the post-World War I peace negotiations. Chapter 4, Enclosure and Exclusion in National Mapping, looks at the rise of national mapping in the 20th century in conjunction with the emergence of a nation-state system based on the twin goals of securing bounded territories and producing homogeneous national populations. This chapter focuses in particular on Turkey, Iran, and Israel-Palestine. Chapter 5, the last chapter, Mapping Alternative Geographies, opens with the return of super-regional mapping in the context of mid-20th century pan-Arabist discourses, and concludes with a discussion of the persistence of a cartographic obsession with partition in the 21st century Middle East. And then the book ends with a plea for spatial thinking that complicates or subverts the enclosures with which we have all become so familiar, particularly that of the religiously or ethno-linguistically majoritarian nation state. So I just want to add 2 quick points to conclude about how I wanted my book to be, hoped my book would be read and used. So I couldn't have written this book without the rich and growing body of specialized scholarship on the history of cartography in the Middle East and Islamic world that Yossi referred to. And of course, Yossi's own work, along with Emily Savage Smith, is one of those most important sources that enabled my work in this book. So in many parts of the book, I actually am occupied with presenting syntheses of this scholarship. However, at the same time, I pledged to myself that I would not reproduce any maps in the book that I was not subjecting to my own close readings. So throughout the book and everything you're seeing now, I am analyzing myself in addition to bringing in kind of synthesized insights from more specialized scholarship. I also really wanted to, as much as I wanted the maps to be beautiful and you can flip through the book and just enjoy them, I wanted you to gain so much more by reading them side by side with the written text, which engages them directly. So the second point is that I really hoped, as I know did my publisher, that the book would be accessible to a general audience. One of the points of doing that was to make it aesthetically beautiful, and I do think that Reaktion Books always does a really good job with that, and I think they did an amazing job with my book in that sense. For me, what that meant was moving or putting the scholarly scaffolding in the notes and the bibliography rather than in the written text or the captions. And in fact, a little bit of a kind of struggle over the captions. I wanted them to be longer than the publisher wanted them to be. But in any case, all of the information is there in the notes for sure. So I wanted scholars and students to be able to use the book as a way of finding further sources to do research or for further investigation. So I made, of course, the notes and the bibliography as comprehensive as I possibly could, but there were challenges, one being, again, as Yossi alluded to, the rapid movement of the field. I mean, there were new books coming out as my book was going to production, and it was a little nerve-wracking, and also within the constraints of my publisher. So I think that's all I have to say. I have the final slide is coming up here that has both my email address at the bottom and a code for 20% off of my book from Reaktion Books or from the University of Chicago Press. And I think you can also use the conference discount code for my book from the University of Chicago Press, which is the US distributor. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciated the opportunity, and thank you to Jordana and Katie for the invitation, and to Kory for moderating this, and to everyone at this conference. It's really an amazing thing. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. These books both look interesting and extremely timely, and really are a feast for the eyes when I look at all these images. So we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any, please send them to me in the chat, if you will, or in the open chat. And to start, both of you, like I said, feast for the eyes. These images and maps are incredible, and you both mention in many respects the necessity to kind of pare down the amount that you probably would have liked to include in the text. Can you talk a little bit about the selection of maps that you used? Did you have a selection that you thought of as you wrote the book, or did you kind of want to write the book and then kind of go out and search for specific maps that perhaps fit into your chapters or your outlines of the text?
Well, I'll start. My main sorting mechanism was that I was interested in regional and super regional maps. So for instance, maps of cities, I don't neglect them entirely, but I don't use very many of them. So I was really interested in kind of meta-geographical ideas and how we can understand them through maps. For the earlier periods, it was a little easier because I'd already done a lot of my own research on them. So I kind of knew what I wanted to focus on. But for the modern period, not only was it harder, but as we all know, there's so many maps that it really was very difficult. I had to choose places and then focus on the kinds of ideas I wanted to express.
Okay. And Yossef, I don't know if you want to add your.
Just to say, yeah, I tried for the map, looked for the map makers and tried to understand the logic of the map making, and then those maps that I thought best represented the point I wanted to make about that particular map maker, and then also other maps in that genre, which then I could compare it with.
Awesome. Great. Anyone have any questions for our authors? So I have one from Catherine Piak. Do these books have maps connecting the Middle East to the Song dynasty? And she's thinking of Zhao Rauga's descriptions of the Middle East. Don't know if that.
Mine does not.
Okay.
I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I think we perhaps Eurocentric of me. Those when I did have maps not from or originating from the Middle East, they were European maps to compare with. And I should have perhaps included the Chinese maps, but I have not.
Great, thank you. This is for both speakers from Matthew Edney. How can the multiple languages and scripts be managed? Good question.
Yeah, actually, this is a great question, because part of my problem is what is an Islamic map? This is not an easy question, I think. So for me, it's easier perhaps than for Zayde, because all the maps I'm dealing with are written in Arabic script. Some of them use in Turkish or Persian, but still Turkish and Persian pre-modern that are written in Arabic script. So, you know, it's no question of my linguistic skills, but in terms of the uniformity or unity of that world of Islam, this is one of, I would say, the features that make it a coherent world, even if the map was not made by a Muslim, or the information is not by Muslims. The use of the Arabic script is one of the indication of the connection of a map into the cultural world, which we call the world of Islam today.
Yeah, so I'll just say also that absolutely it's a huge challenge, and is probably one of the reasons that choosing to do something more like what Jordana Dim and Carl Offen did with mapping Latin America would have been a way to maybe a better way to tackle that challenge. So I had the same benefit that Yossi is talking about for the first 2 chapters because of my training in medieval Middle East and Arabic script. But when I got to the 19th and 20th centuries, it was much, much harder for me. And so in the colonial mapping, I focus on British and French maps because I have those languages. And then after that, it was involving leaning heavily on others, on secondary scholarship that's already out there, as well as my colleagues who are specialists in modern Turkey, modern Iran, modern Israel, really helped me in these areas. But it's again, this question of whether one should try to kind of synthesize and do something that will be coherent and cohesive, which I tried to do, or whether one should outsource to people who really have more expertise in the different areas and languages.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I think we're gonna go ahead and stop. I know that the plenary starts in 2 minutes and I've been told to be strict with time. I believe one of the secretaries is going to share the plenary Zoom information here before the end there. Isabel's done that. So thank you both. I think these are amazing projects and beautiful to look at and very timely, I think, with the world today. So thank you so much. I appreciate you guys talking about them.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
All right, bye everyone.
Yes, bye.